Welcome to Deep Pockets, the podcast for exploring how basic science, once created in a lab and funded by public means, is fueling the economy with completely new private industries. Deep Pockets is created by Petra Soderling.
This episode of Deep Pockets goes right into the heart of what I wanted to convey when I started planning for the series. Winners and losers do not tell the whole story. David Wood, Futurist, catalyst, author, and Singularitarian, phrases it as follows.
The story of the evolution of smartphones is fascinating in its own right, for its rich set of characters and for its colourful set of triumphs and disasters. But the story has wider implications. Many important lessons can be drawn from careful review of the successes and, yes, the failures of the smartphone industry. When it comes to the development of modern technology, things are rarely as simple as they first appear. Some companies bring great products to the market, true. These companies are widely lauded. But the surface story of winners and losers can conceal many twists and turns of fortune. Behind an apparent sudden spurt of widespread popularity, there frequently lies a long gestation period. The eventual blaze of success was preceded by the faltering efforts of many pioneers who carved new paths into uncertain terrain. The steps and missteps of these near-forgotten pioneers laid the foundation for what was to follow.
In this episode, we discuss with David Wood, who held core positions in the executive teams behind Europe's pioneering tech companies Psion and Symbian, what were those early days like. Welcome to the show, David.
Thank you, Petra. It's my pleasure to be here.
In your book Smartphones and Beyond, you describe the rise and fall of Symbian OS, once powering the vast majority of the world's smartphones. The story of Symbian starts off as the story of Psion in London in the 1980s. You worked at Psion from 1988 until 1998 when it gave birth to Symbian. What were those 10 years like?
Well, Psion was a great experience. A great place to work. But it was also a place of intense, hard effort, with the periods of intense hard work often continuing far longer than anyone had predicted or wanted. We were very ambitious in what we were trying to do. We were creating the next generation of handheld computers, as we saw them. That hard work that we ended up doing arose from our own ambition and our commitment to creating these breakthrough new product categories and product platforms. And along the way to these eventual successes, there was many disappointments, delays, doubts, and even despair before the disruptions finally resulted in the significant products and market success that we'd hoped for. And one point about these delays is that they used up much more cash than had been anticipated. It was only because Psion still had previous generation products doing very well in the market, and these sales continued to hold up well, higher than we had any right previously to expect. That was the only way that could keep on funding what we were doing. And if these sales had dropped off, if the trajectory of Psion would have probably been very different, and Symbian probably would never have existed. And I offer that example as part of a general pattern that applies far wider than just the single company Psion. With disruptive technology that takes time to develop into a useful, reliable form, there's often a long disappointment before the actual disruptive breakthrough. Now, it might ask, well, what was it about Psion that did allow us, in the end, to create several generations of world-beating product families? And it's difficult to prove any cause and effect, and I'm dubious about many success stories that people write about their past history. Often they were quite lucky and they forget about the luck and they just said, I did X and I was successful, therefore X must be responsible for my success. Whereas I think it's often much more mixed than that. But I have given a lot of thought as to what was special about Symbian when we were successful, and that grew out of the original culture at Psion too, which gave birth to Symbian. So perhaps if you like, I can offer a few comments on that pioneering culture, because I think it's relevant to many other companies. And that culture came from Imperial College in London, where the founder of Psion, David Potter, had been a lecturer on physics, and some of his core staff had joined him. David Potter, by the way, went on to be the first chairman of Symbian too. There was a respect for learning, a respect for knowledge, a respect for intelligence, but it was very much a practical intelligence. It wasn't knowledge for knowledge's sake or knowledge for cleverness' sake. It was always oriented around real-world applications, and it was tied up with a strong desire that computing technology should be useful for not just computer geeks, but for, quotes, ordinary people. And in many discussions over the years at Scion about what we should include in various products, people would say, no, we can't do it like this because my nan or my aunt or my mother wouldn't be able to understand it. We have to make it simpler. We have to make it more obvious. We have to make it more intuitive. So that passion for usability, along with a passion for reliability and robustness, that no data that people entered into these devices should ever be lost. And that grew out of some hard practical experiences in the early days when some of the prototype products had been used by the partners, wives or others of some of our management team, and they fell in love with the devices. They entered the data into it, and then suddenly the data was all gone. And it was a terrible, agonizing thing that they reported back. What's happened? What have you done to us? And we analysed and we figured out that, the batteries had failed at just the wrong moment and the algorithm did not cope with that particular failure. And so we learned about the importance for data reliability. We learned the importance of what David Potter, the founder of Scion, called frugality, which wasn't just being frugal with money, it was being frugal with energy. That we should not rely on powerful batteries or powerful hardware to solve problems. We should solve problems with efficient software. And we had a saying, Moore gives, but Gates takes away, referring to Gordon Moore's law about improving power of hardware. Every 18 months, there's twice the power for the same cost. But we also saw that Bill Gates' software tended to get slower faster than the hardware got faster, if that makes sense. In the midst of all of that, we took the long-term view. We weren't just designing one product. We were designing a platform that would last for a long term. And we weren't just looking after the present generation. When we were building a new generation, sometimes there were arguments. Some people said, put more money into maintaining the present generation. That's where the cash is coming from now. But on the whole, the company said, yes, but it's a limited runway there. We have to switch over to the new product. So there was a long-term view. And that was tied up with something else I think is very important. We were very deliberate about strategy. We didn't just do what came into our minds at any old moment. We took the time to set aside the issues of the day, to set aside the firefighting, as it were, to separate ourselves off and think hard about strategy. Out of all of the things we could do, which were the right things to do. And sometimes that meant giving up the things that previously had been very important. So Scion, for example, had made its early money, a lot of it by selling games software for some of the earliest home computers. But Scion saw that the market was changing in a way that emphasized more first-person shooter and fast action games rather than the cerebral games like chess and Scrabble and backgammon that science culture felt more comfortable with. So there's a conscious decision not to invest much longer in these gaming programs, but to switch into different fields. And that's how the Scion Organizer and the handheld was made. And later on, when we were trying to upgrade some of our products, we had thousands of ideas of how to improve each of the apps, but we were quite careful to pick the few that we thought would make the biggest difference. So switching from a product called the Series 3 to one called the 3A, which was the first really successful product that we made. It sold 1 million devices. We decided to focus on just a few applications, including an agenda app, and all the other ideas we had about doing lots of things to the other apps were carefully pared back. We had another saying, which was, we have to be prepared to kill your puppies or strangle your puppies in order to ship a successful product. Anybody could kill slugs, things that you don't like, but you had to be able to let go of things that you wanted and loved in order to be successful. So there was a discipline there too. So these are some of the characteristics of Scion which I think served Scion well and which were taken for a while into Symbian, which was given rise to. Maybe I'll just end with one other kind of general principle, which is that I think any long-term company, a company that wants to survive in the long term, needs to do three things very well. You need to be able to focus on the present product and its needs. You need to be good at keeping your commitments. Operational excellence, it's often called, managing cash flow, managing projects. You also need to be good at spotting the increments, how you can make your current product significantly better, making it faster. Like we did when we moved from the 3 to the 3A, and later when we moved up even larger to the Series 5, which had a 32-bit operating system instead of a 16-bit operating system, and that became the basis for Symbian OS. So there's the incremental step-ups, the foreseeable future, as I call it. But you also have to be ready to spot the elephant on the footpath, the things that you weren't expecting, the thing that changes the game. And Cyan did have the ability to see that as well. We saw that an elephant was coming for the space in which we lived, and that elephant was the mobile phone industry. And that required a lot of strategic reflection as well. What do we do? Do we ignore it? Do we just double down and keep on doing what we already did and loved? Or do we adapt ourselves in anticipation of that emerging smartphone market? And that's what we decided to do. It was a difficult and hard decision, but I think one that was profoundly correct. And it was in part because we took the time to do this strategy well.
You mentioned games in terms of software, sort of early apps, but video games and game consoles that came out in the 80s and 90s were also groundbreaking in the hardware form factors. Did you at Cyan consider gaming as a hardware template as well?
Well, we had different form factors in mind. The first was a kind of a rectangular block, which had a simple ABCD keyboard, and which was the most compact. It fitted in people's large shirt pockets. It was the original Organizer and the Organizer 2, so that was the template. And yes, there were a few games on there too, but it was when we moved on to the devices that were more like clamshells. I'm doing the actions, but of course they won't be conveyed in the audio. More like the Palm Tops now. And we were quite radical in some ways with these Palm Tops. We were brave enough to change the conventions about the QWERTY keyboard. Nowadays, everybody's quite happy to have alternative keyboards, but it took quite a while for us to convince ourselves we could be slightly QWERTY, but not completely QWERTY. And on there, we had some very successful games, including a very good implementation of chess, originally in a very small number of bytes, highly efficient. And so there were still some games, and then we had games that took advantage of the graphics on there. So it wasn't particularly fast and furious, although there were a few games like that. It was games that engaged the users. And still, people tell me they play emulations of these games today on some of their devices. So that was a long-term view. And that showed us that add-ons were important, and add-ons that we hadn't anticipated in detail, which meant it was important to be open, not to dictate in advance what would be the successful apps and what wouldn't be the successful apps. Instead, the community as a whole, the developers, would be important. And that's why we had a series of developer conferences going back to 1992, in which there were always games developers as well as people who were trying to develop business apps.
So in a way, you were envisioning the app economy that exists today and laying the technical and strategical foundation for what was to come later.
That's right. And I still have my notes, my PowerPoints for that 1992 present conference when I gave 3 different PowerPoints. It's when we all learned PowerPoint. We took 2 weeks off so the people were going to be involved, and we discovered this amazing software, which is still why I like using PowerPoint to this day. At this first conference, we had, I think, 20 developers. So it was a small stepping stone. But the one year later, 1993, it was up to about 40 or 50 developers. And people realized, there was a marketplace here for games. I don't think any of these original developers became particularly rich, but it showed what needed to be done. It also led me on to a trajectory of supporting the developers. So this is when I had my first public email address at that stage, dw2@kix.compulink.co.uk. As a result of being on this online bulletin board system. In America, I had CompuServe. In Europe, Kix, CIX, was quite popular. And although in my daytime, as it were, I was developing software, increasingly in my evenings, I was answering questions from developers. How could they do this incredible thing? Connect to the alarm server? How could they connect to the set of world cities and countries? And so I would provide interfaces to the developers. And it showed me many of the requirements for looking after developers, which I developed further in my time looking after many of the developer relations inside Symbian.
At the same time when Scion was building the 32-bit Epoch platform as an upcoming smartphone operating system, Apple was there, Microsoft was there with their own PDA visions. You have an interesting anecdote on Apple's Newton device. Here's a quote from your book, Smartphones and Beyond.
The first Newton went on sale in 1993. 5 years later, with original company founder Steve Jobs back at its helm, Apple discontinued the entire device family. Sales had been extremely disappointing. There were so many unwanted Newtons that InfoWorld blogger Robert Cringley could claim in July 1995 that Apple had been forced to dump 30,000 brand new Newton message pads in a Los Angeles landfill, where they were crushed under the treads of a bulldozer.
This is pretty remarkable and just tells how turbulent these early times were.
There were many people who invested long and hard to try and create what we might now recognize as the iPad or the iPhone. But it was too early, and it wasn't obvious that it was too early. So the team at Newton had many brilliant engineers, and it didn't quite work. Quite a few of them went on to work later at another company called General Magic, and they did some remarkable things too, but also they failed as well. It was just too hard to get everything right, and General Magic have admitted subsequently that they failed to spot the importance of web browsing until too late. So there were a lot of efforts to try and break in, and again, it confirms the pattern that with truly disruptive products, often there's a kind of exponential curve in capability, which lags behind for a long time our expectations. So we overestimate what may be possible in the short term, but then we tend to underestimate what finally happens in the longer term. And that was our case as well. We knew that the market would eventually be large. We didn't quite imagine exactly how large it would be.
So that Apple story was from 1993. Then in 1996, 3 years later, Microsoft launched Pegasus, their own 32-bit operating system. But you had met Bill Gates even earlier than this. Tell us what happened.
Bill Gates came to see Scion in, I think, 1989. And the reason for that was that we were in Scion doing our laptops. They weren't called laptops then. We called them mobile computers. And we were doing two with our own Epoch software, 16-bit predecessor of Symbian OS. But the view was we should also, as a safety, do one on DOS. And there was two DOSes at that time. There was DR-DOS, digital DOS, and MS-DOS. And for a while we thought DR-DOS was technically better. But Bill Gates heard about this, and he went on a tour around Europe. I mean, this came up later in the FDA, the American inquiry into monopolistic practices, abuse of power, that he told many companies, he made many promises about MS-DOS, which turned out to be unfounded. He came to see Scion to convince Scion not to use DR-DOS and MS-DOS, and one of my programming colleagues, Robert Ramsey, said to me, "Hey, I've just seen Bill Gates." And I thought, Bill Gates? I've heard that name before. And I said to him, "Who's Bill Gates?" And that got written down in the quotes file for Scion, and it was quoted back to me many times subsequently. I have to say, we all studied Microsoft and Bill Gates very carefully. We realized he was a competitor, but in some ways also an inspiration, because what we wanted to do with being provider of the preferred operating system for mobile computers, wireless computers, was like being the Microsoft of that space. So we did learn a lot from Microsoft along the years. And my views on Bill Gates have changed a lot as he has mellowed.
What a story. You've described the history of Scion as a device creator, but then towards the end of 1990s, you decided to move towards software licensing model. One pivotal date in this storyline is Wednesday, March the 13th, 1996, when the Nokia N9000 communicator was launched. This was like a PDA, but it had a cellular GSM connection. It looked like a real Gordon Gekko cell phone, but it had fax, email, and a calendar, all of the modern business tools. Tell us how that product was received at Scion.
So in March 1996, we were already under some distress because our project to create the 32-bit operating system had taken much longer than anyone had expected, and it still was by no means clear. There was a lot of pressure that, hey, we've got to speed up. And we looked at what the competitors were doing on the whole, and nothing really worried us until this Nokia 9000 communicator was announced, probably at CeBIT. And the photographs appeared, and my colleague, Bill Batchelor, long-time Scion programming supremo, he took the picture, put it on the kitchen, and I say the kitchen because most of the development was done on one floor, and he wrote on it, "That competition has arrived," with a big exclamation mark. So we could see, the world was changing. And about the same time, a Sunday Times journalist came to see David Potter, the leader of Scion, and he asked provocatively, "Well, Scion, are you going to die like Apple, or are you going to die like IBM?" And the view was that Apple had the best technology, but was being outclassed. This was on the desktop market, was being outclassed by inferior software by Microsoft simply because it was available on a much wider range. And the journalist was saying, look, you may have the best software, the cleverest guys, but you're going to be outclassed because there are other software coming along by other providers. So then could Scion take the leaf out of IBM, which had the relationship with Microsoft? And in IBM's first PC, there was IBM hardware and Microsoft software. But IBM had also been perceived as dying because Microsoft then gave away the same software to multiple other companies, many of which then outclassed IBM. And it's all ironic because, of course, both Apple and IBM didn't die. They had their near-death experiences. IBM's PCs were one of the world's leaders for a long time, and Apple, of course, thrived. But this question was very much on Scion's minds. How could we cope with this increasingly competitive world? So could we share the costs of building this software? Could we get more people using it apart from Scion? And that's eventually, after a long strategic review, involving people like Stephen Randall, who we engaged as a contractor. He had been previously the founder of another long forgotten handheld computing company, and that used a different operating system, GeoS from GeoWorks. So he had done this operating system, and it hadn't really succeeded, but he came to give advice to Scion and look at the pros and cons of licensing the software. And he pointed out there would be other markets, including something he called smart-phone. This was late in 1995, the first mention of that in my archives. And he said, well, the market is hard to estimate, but it's probably going to be large. And we should probably tailor our software in a way that it would be capable of running on these other devices as well. And to do that, we're going to have to assume a wider ecosystem that wouldn't just be Scion using us. We already had some success with a different manufacturer called Acorn, which is also the parent company of ARM, that of course has done much better in the long term. But Acorn took some of our Scion software and repurposed it for educational purposes, doing things like leaving out the password protection in the word processor because mischievous school children would probably password protect things they shouldn't password protect, and so on. So that was a simple customization, and so we were going to allow more customization. So we started talking more widely. We hired a few salespeople who had actually been our hardware engineers or marketing specialists in the past. They moved into this new role. We talked first to Philips, which was one of the leading manufacturers of mobile phones at the time. And they had some very innovative and exciting ideas. So we signed up a project with Philips. And then we started talking to a strange Finnish company called Nokia. And we could see they were different. At the same time that they were doing these Nokia 9000 communicators with GeoWorks, they were considering their long-term strategic evolution too, and it was clear that they were actually frustrated by some of the limitations of the GEOS software that was in their first 9000. It was a 16-bit software. They really wanted to get to 32 bits. Otherwise, it was too hard to program advanced applications. So they were looking around. And then we talked to Ericsson as well. And by December 1996, we did another careful off-site strategy review. And we rather bravely decided we were going to deprioritize the product segment of our Scion flagship device, the separate unconnected PDA, and we're going to prioritize instead support for mobile communication devices, particularly small mobile communication devices. It's a very brave strategic decision going against our current customers' strongest desires, but again, I think it was the right long-term decision. But we knew that would require even more funding, and that's why the idea of Symbian came around, as spinning off Scion Software, a separate division, and gaining funding from the lead customers, which were Nokia and Ericsson, slightly later Motorola, who put in funds that valued the new Symbian company at £100 million.
I remember in the early 2000s, the Red Herring magazine ran a cover page article titled Men Behaving Badly. They referred to MEN, that's Motorola, Ericsson, and Nokia, joining forces behind Symbian and leaving other OEMs out of the game. Do you remember this type of press coverage?
Well, I do remember that Red Herring wrote some nice articles about us. They had the understanding that this was a long-term disruption that was going on and that Symbian was in a leading role. We were quite careful at the beginning not to let too many cooks into the kitchen at the same time. Or as Anders Vesterlid of Ericsson famously said, we can invite more people into the boat once you started moving, but let's not have too many different navigators at the very beginning. So we were careful to exclude some of the other companies that we thought didn't have the same long-term vision or the deep commitment to this market, but not to restrict them as licensees. We would talk to anybody who wanted to talk to us. We would license the software if we saw sufficient signs of commitment to at least one project with us, but we would keep the initial governing team small with a view to expanding it. So Motorola came on board quite soon afterwards, and then Panasonic, which at that time was the world's number 4, and then Siemens, which was also one of the leading phone manufacturers, and Samsung came on later too. So we did expand, but not in a way that would be too disruptive to the leading management team.
Yeah, all of these names that are basically gone from the smartphone industry now. Philips, Siemens, Panasonic, and others.
Quite.
One name that's not gone, though, is ARM. You talked a little about the role of semiconductor in the way you approached Nokia. ARM was close to your headquarters, if I remember correctly.
So we were geographically close, that's right. ARM was in Cambridge, just up the M11, about an hour's drive from London. But there was a background as to why the relationship between ARM and Symbian became strong, which was going back to the design of our 32-bit operating system and the device, the Series 5, that would run on it. And previously we were unsure what kind of chips to put in there. What made Scion successful, in part, was the design of a hardware platform in parallel with the design of a software platform, a bit like what Apple does. It designs the hardware and the software in tandem. So we had brilliant world-class hardware designers like Mark Gretten and Mark Kovanvich, and world-class engineer manager like Ken McAlpine, all of whom have gone on to great careers elsewhere since these days. And in the decision as to the hardware platform, there's a hard decision as to what kind of RISC architecture to put in there. So Colin Myers, who became the first CEO of Symbian, and Mark Gretten spent months investigating lots of different competing RISC architectures, mainly from Japan, and ARM was a late entry into this set, and we eventually decided, ARM was the best. So this was a wonderful example of long-term strategic vision. I can't claim any credit for that personally. I had no idea what was going on there, but this cemented the relationship. And we felt a lot of kindred spirit with the ARM executives. The Symbian and ARM executives would occasionally meet to exchange ideas to the two executives grouping together. ARM went on to be a much more successful company than Symbian ever did, but we did aspire to the same kind of success. And it wasn't just ARM, there were other aspects in the stack as well. We depended a lot on Texas Instruments, and they had some far-sighted people who created a wireless division inside Texas Instruments to use the ARM architecture to design their own OMAP chips. And Nokia separately had already decided that they were going to use ARM. So that was a separate decision. And when Nokia talked to ARM and said, well, what should we do about operating system? The people in ARM kindly said, you should at least consider the guys from Symbian. They've got some very attractive devices under play. So there was a mix of companies involved, and we had a sufficiently good rapport, which served us well.
Earlier you mentioned how PDAs and devices need to be usable by children and grandmothers and others. One of the things that you describe is about Symbian is that pioneering technology is not just technology. It's about the first use cases, beta testing with users, laying the first commercial opportunity. Tell us how this was first laid out in Symbian.
So, of course, we were interested in technology. We were technology geeks. But it had to be technology that would appeal to ordinary people. That was our guiding principle. You shouldn't need to understand software in order to use these devices. But we realized what we would create would be complicated. We realized that there would be applications. We realized there would be variety in what we created. We realized early on that one of the reasons phone manufacturers like to talk to us was that we gave them some leeway in terms of implementing their own product conception. Different, I have to say, from Microsoft at the time, which was much more firm in its views. They had decided how the software should look. They had clear views on how the hardware should function, and that was limited. And although Microsoft were very effective in what they did, many of the phone manufacturers wanted more leeway involved. So we decided we would aim at supporting a variety of licenses with openness in our system. So we architected it with openness in mind. It was not a one design fits all model at all. Although there would be the same operating system, so applications written for one could be easily adapted for a different device family, as we call them. We created these device family reference designs, DFRD, an unlovely acronym that went around for a number of years. And it was also tied up with ensuring that in due course, the software would run in lower and lower cost devices and therefore reach larger and larger markets, but would still be perceived as easy to use. So in that way, we envisioned that in due course, everybody might be using a Symbian smartphone. Bill Gates famously had said back in 1976 or thereabouts that the vision for Microsoft was a microcomputer on every desk and in every office running Microsoft software. So around about the year 2000, we had the view that the vision was a smartphone in every pocket running Symbian OS. And we didn't literally mean every pocket, although Colin Mars, our CEO, sometimes did go on stage with a different smartphone in every pocket of lots of pockets he had, and he would drag them out and show, look at this incredible device, look at that incredible device. But we meant that everybody in the world would have such a device. And that was a different mindset. And it's sort of come true that almost everybody in the world nowadays uses a smartphone. Sadly, it was not a Symbian OS that was in there. It's other operating systems that came along and displaced us eventually. But these other companies saw the scale of the market on account of what Symbian and Nokia and our other licensees achieved, and that drew other very powerful companies in there. And they shared the same vision that it had to be usable by the mass market and it had to be something with a long-term potential.
I remember the year when someone announced that this is the year the number of mobile phones exceeds the number of toothbrushes in the world. But would you say that the fact that you let OEMs decide the form factor became the demise of Symbian? Should you have been tougher or stricter?
Well, that's a hard question. The OEMs did things that they actually added real value to their products, which we could not have done by ourselves. It came about more because we lost our power in the early days. In the beginning, the licensees had a great respect for the software we developed. They loved what was done in the Science Series 5. They could see it was world-class and world-beating. But what we needed to do next required even more investment, and we weren't able, in retrospect, to fully appreciate the scale of what was ahead. And in my views, we probably underinvested, even though there was lots of money, and even though we grew quite quickly. Probably we should have found ways to grow even faster. I wrote a document in 2001 which anticipated by 2007 there would be 100 million Symbian smartphones created. And I fed off ideas from some of my colleagues, such as Stephen Randall, in envisioning a roadmap for the next 6 years. In 2001, there was less than 1 million, so that was quite a step up. And that turned out to be correct. We did reach 100 million shipped by 2007. But in that document, I said, well, the question of what operating system will power these new devices, it's $1 billion question, I said. $1 billion. That's why it's worth investing a lot. Turns out I was wrong by an order of magnitude. The question of the successful operating system in these devices is more like $1 trillion question, because after all, Apple solved that, and on the backs of their success with iOS, they became the world's first $1 trillion public company. And Google did a great deal also by having its Android, and they too became $1 trillion valuation. Now, if we'd really seen that, we could have argued for more investment. Well, what happened is that we weren't able to deliver all that we had promised, and we fell a bit behind. And there was a kind of despair by some of our licensees at our capabilities. And at a strategic offsite in 2001, held in a place in the suburbs of London called Nightingale Lane, so this was Project Nightingale, that we decided we would give away some of the power of the upper layers to the manufacturers, and we would concentrate on the lower layers. And this was sort of a mistake because the manufacturers, although they were capable in software, they weren't as good in software as we were. And although they did some fine things, in the end, the disconnects between the upper layers, such as Nokia's Series 60, also known as S60, or the corresponding things in other branches of the Symbian OS, caused more and more problems over the years. So it was a mistake in retrospect. How we could have avoided it is hard to say. We would have needed some way to generate even more funding. And Sign at this time were apprehensive. They had already invested a lot of their own value in this company, and if it had failed, they would have suffered greatly. So they were reluctant to put two more into us.
Talking about money and being in 2001, Nokia launched the 9210 communicator, and then in 2002, Symbian shipped a 3G-enabled version of the Symbian operating system. This podcast is called Deep Pockets since we're talking about how government investments fuel private industries. And of course, smartphones need a telecommunications network in order to function, and many of those networks were built at the time with money from different governments in different countries. To what extent would you say public regulation and financial support in the early 2000s helped the smartphone industry?
Well, there would not be a smartphone industry if there had not been large government support for the GSM standardization effort and the networks that came along. I echo the analysis of the economist Mariano Mazzucato, who has written in her book that the real father of devices such as the iPhone is the public government, defense spending, and so on, that created many of the standards on which these devices benefited. So, of course, we software engineers and hardware engineers like to feel that the credit should belong to us, but it would not be possible without the wider infrastructure. And so, of course, the GSM networks were important, but there were many other standards and many other bits of technology, such as the standardization of the World Wide Web, which of course had been funded initially by the CERN project, which had housed Tim Berners-Lee as he put his initial ideas on HTML into the place. And there was lots of others as well. Regulation of the devices was important too. Before a device was allowed to connect to the wireless networks, the wireless operators insisted on various tests. And that was important to avoid the network being damaged. Arguably, I think some of this went a bit too far. Some of the network operators, for example, didn't really like third-party applications. They were worried that if a user installed a third-party application onto a device, apart from a limited set that they knew and loved, that it would add to support risks. People would ring up the support staff of the network operator and say their phone's not working and it would be due to a third-party app. They were worried about security risks, about the spread of malware, which was already causing problem on PCs. They didn't want that on their phones. And I have to say the operators were also worried by the risk of revenue bypass. They made lots of money from text messages, and they were worried by apps that we nowadays call WhatsApp that would allow people to send messages or voice over IP calls that would take some of the revenues. So these network operators resisted having too many phones with too many apps, and they pressurized the phone manufacturers to emphasize simpler devices and lower costs, and that turned out to be a mistake. Apple stood up to that. Apple had the confidence that they would just tell the network operator what the phone would look like, and they were successful in a way that ultimately none of Symbion's licensees could do. So that was an interesting story. One more story here is that another aspect of government regulation which caused us problems was to do with cryptography, which was the software that enables a lot of the security systems. And cryptography was classified as an armament, a munition, and therefore it was subject to export control, which meant that we had limitations on what we could do with our source code. And we wanted to ship our source code, for example, to some licensees in China to develop their own devices. We wanted to get Huawei and other companies on board. And I don't remember all the details now, but over the years we had a lot of hiccups in that until we finally made our cryptography software the same as was already open source. And then the argument went away. Oh, and I should mention one other thing in which government policy did help us. The government in Britain for a long time actively encouraged the migration of developers from all over Europe and all over the world indeed to come to London. And if I look at the leading managers in Symbion in the kind of middle phase, so many of them came from Europe or further afield. And sadly, nowadays, it's not quite so welcoming because of the political culture in Britain is quite intolerant of what they see as undesirable immigrants, even though these immigrants could actually earn huge amounts of money for the British taxpayer. So again, the government policy kind of a significant impact on whether these devices are successful or unsuccessful.
That's interesting how you consider government support in much broader terms than just research or R&D funding. We talked about history, but you're actually a futurist. In your book, you discuss what the legacy of smartphone technologies could bring to us in the future. For example, the interactions between the NBIC, that's the nano, bio, info, and cognotech fields. You write that nanotech will give us tiny devices. Tiny sensors help neuroscience figure out how the mind works. Insights from neuroscience feed into machine intelligence. Improving machine intelligence accelerates R&D in every field, and biotech and IT advances will make body and machine connectable. You wrote this in 2014. How do you see these predictions today?
I think that's broadly a good summary. We do have better artificial intelligence today, in part because we have understood the human brain some more, and we are copying some features of the human brain into some of our AI. It's still early days with what some people call the fourth industrial revolution, which is at heart the combination of these four separate NBIC revolutions. And I think as the next decade goes on, we're going to see more control over computing at the hardware level. We'll eventually see quantum computing. We will also see new kinds of chips being created, which will be dedicated to AI. We already have them with Google's TPUs, other companies' IPUs, as they're called. And so this prediction, I think, is correct. I'll also say I consider myself to have been a futurist whilst I was working in the mobile phone industry. At least when I was head of research from 2004 onwards, that was my job title, to look ahead as to the disruptions that would come, some of which I was able to persuade Symbian to adapt to in time, and others I was unsuccessful in persuading us to do enough about, at the ultimate cost of the well-being of the company. So I was a futurist then. In fact, even at the beginning of Symbian, when we did our horizon scanning to decide that we should move into smartphones, we were futurists then. And I think everybody should be better at foreseeing the future. And I can say more about what I think is coming next in terms of smartphones, because I often do a picture when I talk to companies. I say, much as I've covered with you in this podcast, I say, well, of course, there were the original phones, sometimes called feature phones or sometimes less flatteringly dumb phones, and companies like Sign and Symbian, but also BlackBerry from RIM, and also Palm with its various wireless devices too. We saw that we could create smartphones, and it took a long time to be successful. So there was a handover there that took many years to a second wave from phones. And then there was another handover with another elephant coming. It wasn't the elephant of the wireless industry, it was the elephant of Silicon Valley, which eventually, through Apple and Google, were successful, but there were many failures and disappointments before then too. Apple had some disastrous phone experiments, which history has tended to airbrush out, but there was something called the Rocker, which had the hardware from Motorola, similar to the Razr phone, which was very successful, and it had some Apple iTunes software on top, and it sort of had the worst of both worlds. And Steve Jobs, the CEO of Apple, and Mike Zawarowski, who ran Motorola at the time, had a very public falling out, blaming each other. But Steve Jobs learned from that. And then there were multiple attempts to create what was eventually be the iPhone. Android also took a long time to reach its success. Andy Rubin had the initial idea for Android in 2003, and it took 7 years before Android was selling 10 million units a year. So there was a second disruption there. So I put this up on my slides, and people say, 1990s dumb phones, 2000 and aughties, first wave of smartphones, Symbian, BlackBerry, 2010s, Apple and Google. Well, David, what's coming next? And I backtrack a little bit. I'll say, well, there's no firm pattern here. I don't have a crystal ball. I can't tell you for sure when this next disruption is coming. Nor can I even tell you whether existing companies will migrate in there. It's not always new companies that are successful in the disruptions. After all, Nokia is an example of a company that successfully rode a major disruption, moving from success in feature phones to success in smartphones. And we look at Microsoft as well. They didn't succeed in mobile phones, but they did manage another transition very well, which was from when the most important information on PCs was originated on PCs to the most important information coming over the web. In 1995, famously, Bill Gates slammed on the brakes, wrote some memos inside Microsoft and said, oh my goodness, World Wide Web is much more important than we'd previously thought. So they invested hard in developing an internet browser. And they made that transition fine too. So some of the leaders in today's wave could be leaders in the next wave. But maybe I'll just quickly say a few things of what that next wave might consist of. It could be that the famous saying of Mark Andreessen, leading venture capitalist, software is eating the world, will be eclipsed by a new saying, software written by AI is eating the world, or simply AI is eating the world. It could be that the company that has the best UI, that is AI powered, and therefore is more intuitive and more natural, will be the one that suddenly people say, gosh, this phone is so easy to use. It, as if it can read my mind. It really knows in advance. A bit like when you're typing in the search bar today, it often fills in what it thinks you're going to search for. Well, the phones will increasingly anticipate. So the companies that have leaps ahead in AI capability may suddenly leave all the other phones behind. But there's another vision of the future, which is that users will prioritize privacy and security much more than they do currently. There will be a growing tech clash against the big tech companies. It's already happened. People have love-hate relationships with Facebook. They say, I'm leaving Facebook. It's terrible. And then they stay because they're sort of restricted to stay. They feel compelled to stay. Well, this could get worse. And it could be that the company which convinces users that they are really on the side of the user, that they really are protecting their data, will be the leaders. It could be the company that makes a success of healthcare. We have health sensors in lots of devices currently, and they work quite well, but they don't work well enough yet to be sufficiently compelling reason to choose one device rather than another. And finally, it could be the company that has the best augmented reality support. We know we're going to a metaverse sooner or later. You and I are talking over the internet now. In due course, we will have Google Glasses or something like Google Glasses. Maybe it'll be Facebook's Ray-Ban glasses they've just announced. Maybe it'll be things that Apple produce. Maybe it'll be a version of Microsoft's HoloLens. But the company that does the most compelling, most attractive, most powerful version of this metaverse may suddenly stop us taking our phones out of our pocket, but we will interact with the glasses instead. And that's been a long, long, long time coming. Eventually it probably will, and the ones who succeed may set the pattern. And in the end of all of that, the device that probably, or the services that people will choose, may be the one that acts as a kind of guardian angel, really on your side, whispering in your ear, go this way, not that way. Stop talking now, David. You've talked too long. Look at this person's face. They're losing interest in you. And it will say all the right things, a bit like the best friend. Not like a friend who nags you and gives you the advice in a way you don't like, so you shrug it off. The friend who knows exactly the right way to help you be an even better version of yourself. And the company that provides that, it's like the voice of God in your head, may be the one that has the leading role in the next 10 to 15 years of devices.
Like the voice of God in your head, David Wood, futurist, catalyst, author, and Singularitarian, thank you very much for spending time with us today.
It's been my pleasure.
You've listened to Deep Pockets by Petra Soderling. Be sure to subscribe for more episodes.